So Ron Powell is gonna starting as a YouTube recording. So unfortunately, Ron couldn't make it. But
hi, thank you for coming to my talk today. I'll be discussing CI/CD benchmarks for high-performing teams in 2021. I hope you're all excited to hear about this presentation. This is really exciting content to me. It is a project that is one of my favorite things that I work on at CircleCI, and so I'm going to be pretty pumped about this presentation, and I hope that you are as well. So a little bit more information about me. I'm the technical content marketing manager at CircleCI, and so that involves a large number of things. But one of the things that it does is it gives me an opportunity to work with technical content that usually looks like tutorials at CircleCI, and so I get to kind of become intimately aware of the way that users utilize our product through a lens that's not often available to most folks at an organization. And so not only am I very much aware of the way that folks use our product, but I also have access to an enormous amount of data about the use of our product. And so I'm here to tell you about the combination of those two things. So just real quickly before we begin, cover a little bit of today's agenda. Really, the first part of this is going to be some setup. I mentioned just a minute ago that I work on a really exciting project at CircleCI. It's about benchmarking data for engineering teams, and so we'll get a little bit into what those benchmarks are, what types of things we measure, and then a little bit of the application at CircleCI, the data set that we collect and through our application, and then just wrapping with the real insights. I mean, this is the part that is the value that we get out of this project is really being able to produce these types of insights. And so a little bit more about CircleCI. CircleCI has been around for about 10 years now. We're in a hyper growth phase where we're adding a large number of employees. Our footprint is now expanded for employee-wise up to 5 countries or 5 continents. But CircleCI is it's a global organization with a global user base. And so being that we've been able to solve continuous integration scenarios for about 10 years now, we've been able to collect a large number of really exciting organizations that build, test, and deploy with CircleCI. And so really the value of this type of experiment is that we get to see the collection of all of the workflows performed by all of the groups in our that are using our product to make some comparisons between them. And so where exactly does CircleCI sit in the application development tool pipeline? I mean, that's really what we're talking about here is application development. These are engineering teams that deliver some type of digital product for their organizations, whether that be a product that's served to customers, whether that be a product that's used internally. Regardless of how that end product is used by an organization, it needs to be built, tested, and delivered. And that is often the role that CircleCI plays for organizations. And so what you see here on the left is the creation or ideation stage of application development. And so that looks like version control for CircleCI users. The version control looks like GitHub and Bitbucket. For the data set that we're looking at today, it is restricted to only GitHub users or organizations that have their version control system, that use GitHub's version control system exclusively. But that still gives us a very large number of folks to consider. And then we have on the right the logistics stage. This is like the deployed into production stage. And so CircleCI has the ability to kind of like operate whatever tasks that you would need to do between the ideation, creation, and the ultimate delivery of your applications to your end users. So because of that, that is the data set that we're going to look at. We're going to look at all of the logos that we had on that previous slide, plus all of the rest of the logos that are running workflows on CircleCI, and see if we can't make heads or tails of the way that those software teams are performing, maybe even get to the point in which we can benchmark levels where we might be able to set expectations for our own teams. So I'll start just by introducing not my report. My report is the state of software delivery, and that is it's in its second year. This here pictured is Puppet's report. They have a report that's been around a little bit longer than ours. I think that they might be at about 10 years for their state of DevOps report. State of DevOps reports. These reports are very widely used in the industry. A lot of people look forward to these coming out every year to see how trends are changing, what things are changing on engineering teams, and how people really are being able to define and derive the value that their engineering teams create. And then once you can define and derive that value that your engineering teams create, then it's all about optimizing and making that as efficient of a pipeline as possible. And so what is the difference between these reports and our report? Because we want some net new, and that's actually what we have. And so the real value of the survey the report that CircleCI has is that it's significantly larger than all of the other reports. And so how is that possible? Well, most of the other reports that are used to define, success for engineering teams that are created from survey data. And so that data has the limitation of there's the self-selection from the folks that are excited enough about their DevOps pipelines to want to participate in a DevOps survey, as well as those questions. There's often a bias towards or because you need a concrete answer from your survey question, a lot of them default towards answering questions around the primary service or application at their organization. And so it's not just self-selection in the folks that are excited and motivated by DevOps, but it's also self-selected in that they are oftentimes only reporting on primary services. And so really the difference between the two is this: it's the performance derived versus performance described. And that, I think, is a real big contribution to the reports that already exist. And so and ultimately what we're getting at is this: what are the metrics that are important to measuring DevOps productivity? We're big surprise we're not going to stray too far from what the bigger reports talk about. And I mean bigger just in that they've been out for a little bit longer. Our reports seems to be doing very well, but the metrics that those reports, there's other reports. There's the DORA report that comes out every year as well, and really we're talking about these 4 subjects. And I'll say subjects because there's going to be a slight difference between the way that these types of metrics can be discussed in a survey, and then the way that they can be discussed, or not discussed, but analyzed on a platform or with a tool. And so things like duration, most of these things may be a little bit self-explanatory. I'll go through just to make sure that we're covering all of these things clearly, though. Duration is going to be the length of time that it takes to move an increment of work through your application development pipeline, right? So because we are a CI tool, we're looking for changes in your version control system. And so when we see those changes, then we can propagate the build, tool, test, and deploy pipelines, or propagate your work through the build, test, and deploy pipeline. And we can measure the length of time that it takes to push that increment of work through your pipeline. The next thing that we have here is mean time to recovery. That mean time to recovery is going to be, with you push an increment of work through your system, if you get a failed signal or a bad signal, if the work that you push through your system was not the work that is desired, how quickly does it take you to get your system back to the stable state that you actually desire? And so this is something that's also really important to measure. Throughput, we're over here looking at number of times you push an increment of work through your system. This is also something very important to measure. Success rate, the number of times you push increment of work through your system, and that increment of work is a successful addition to your code base. Now, all of these things in some way are also discussed in the DORA report, the Puppet report, but they look at things a little bit differently. And they can do that because they're asking these developers about things that don't necessarily happen on the platform. For instance, duration often looks like lead time in some of these other reports. And so the difference between that is going to be, lead time might be while I'm ideating and brainstorming with my team outside, I might be doing some scaffolding on scratch paper, or, doing some ad hoc kind of trying to build out a solution, without necessarily committing code to a code base. Like all of those things could be happening before I get to the point where I update my code base and push an increment through my CI tool. And so I'm missing a lot of visibility into that, But what I can do is I can measure, once you get to the point where you push a commit through your system, then I can measure how quickly that signal, you get a signal that comes back from that. And so a lot of the differences between the ways that these things are discussed in the surveys and in the way that I'm going to discuss them today just have to do with that little bit, that I can only really get visibility into the things that happen on the platform or the tool. And so I'm going to be able to measure and make comparison across all of the organizations in my and their workflows in my data set from that vantage point. So let's get started and see what that looks like. Throughput. So this is, how often do you get code that triggers CI? In large part, the CircleCI is going to run when we see a push to your Git server. And so that's basically the increment of work signal that we are looking for. And then we start to measure that, like we measure the number, the volume of those work signals that are coming through based on that. And so throughput is going to be an interesting thing, especially because we historically know there's companies that get to, go around touting the number of times that they deploy a day. This is the number of times a workflow was run on CircleCI. And so I say workflow and I don't say deploy, because I don't necessarily have visibility into whether a workflow deploys or not. And so I can make the assumption that of the set of workflows that I have, there is a percentage of them or a subset of them that are deploys. And so even with that assumption, what I see when I analyze the data is that, even at 50th percentile, I have less than one commit per day. And so that definitely isn't the same signal that we often get from survey results, where developers sometimes can claim that they're deploying their products tens of times or even greater numbers of times per day. And I don't believe that that's incorrect. I believe that there's a large number of people who are pushing that many commits, but is it the vast majority? I mean, the 50th percentile number here says that that's actually not true. And so this is the most projects aren't deploying dozens of times per day. I think is a really easy thing for us to be able to pull and derive from this information. And I think that sets the level at least into a more reasonable range for us as we start to understand what benchmarking against the quote unquote industry. And I give the quotes just because not. While we have an enormous number of organizations that are on our platform right now, we certainly don't have, it is still just a subset of the application development that's happening on CI tools in the world. And so why is this different from survey data? And again, it's going to be survey data often is about the primary application or service that you work on. And so there could be primary applications or services that are pushed tens, maybe even up to 100 times per day. That would be a very large number of commits per day to a project, but there's any number of scenarios in which that could occur. And so the primary application or service probably is something that's getting that, and our number is as high as it is because those types of primary services and application workflows are what brings it up to one, and that there's the non-primary application or services probably are seeing a lot fewer workflows than what one would imagine, or at least what I had. All right, so now we've gotten to duration. And so duration is one of the more important, I think it's one of the more important of the four metrics for us to consider, because duration covers the amount of time that it takes for a workflow to move through, or an increment of work to move through our system. Now, the reason that I think that this is one of the most important things, I think, is also, I'm gonna lean back into the reports from the industry, from DORA and from Puppet and from other organizations, in which they really do a good job of upselling continuous integration. And so I'm going to take a stance right here and say the continuous integration tools are not just tools where you collect your scripts so that you can run automation. Continuous integration is a philosophy of application development that includes a feedback loop. And that feedback loop requires you to get a signal from the work that you push through your application development pipeline, and then be able to respond to that signal. And so since response to the signal is, I would argue, the absolute most important metric for us to consider, if that's going to be the absolute most important metric to consider, then getting a signal back that allows us to then respond is going to be the second best. And so that really is where this duration sits with me, at least, and I'll show you kind of how that shapes up in the data set. So how long does it take to get results? This is the real value of continuous integration and using these types of tools and these platforms for application development. How quickly can I get a signal back? I mean, you can get a signal back incredibly fast. I mean, the 5% of builds finished in less than 12 seconds. The scale, I just, to pump this a little bit more, the scale of our data set means that 5% of builds finishing under 12 seconds is approximately 500,000 builds that finished in under 12 seconds. That does seem fast. You should think that that seems fast because that is fast, but there is a number of scenarios that are completely legitimate that are finishing in under 12 seconds. I mean, there's a couple of scenarios that I can think of that are probably not incredibly valuable signals to get back. I can print a screen incredibly fast. I might be able to do that in under a second. I can push an artifact to an S3 bucket, depending on how fast that spins up. I mean, there's a number of ways that I can move files around, print things to screen. None of those things are workflows that really add any value, but that would finish incredibly fast. I mean, another example would be that, a workflow with no tests finishes trivially fast, but there's not a whole lot that you can do with a success signal from a workflow that finished with no tests. So what does 12 seconds look like that's legitimate? I mean, I think that it looks like I can run an enormous number of unit tests in about 1 to 2 seconds in parallel. So this 12 seconds gives me enough time to spin up an image, as long as that image is not very large, or maybe even if I'm spinning it up from cache, and then run these workflows at a rapid clip. And so while this is an incredibly low number, 12 seconds is a pretty fast workflow, I don't think that it's unreasonable for teams to actually hit these numbers and actually be getting signals that are valuable. Again, a very large number of unit tests running in parallel could finish in under 12 seconds, and that would be a highly valuable signal to get. 12 seconds was the fifth percentile. It's at the bottom. 95th percentile is at 34 minutes. It's getting pretty long there. 50th percentile is under 4 minutes. That's pretty fast. That's very fast. So what does this mean for your team? I mean, I told you there's a number of scenarios in which you could probably get this down to 12 seconds or below, depending on what your goals for that particular workflow were. Ideally, we would be trying to get a signal back that's as valuable as possible. And when I say that, and I mean like a large number of unit tests run in under 12 seconds, we're basically at the unit layer. As soon as we start getting more advanced testing through integration layers and UI and UX tests, we start to immediately bog our workflows down. Those tests take longer to run. Those tests often can't run in parallel. They have dependencies that have to be built before them. And so, as we start getting up into the order of minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 21 minutes, 35 minutes, what that looks like is a lot more test coverage. And oftentimes it could look like, not the most efficient continuous integration builds as well. And so all of that's here, all of that's listed here. And so what would be a reasonable recommendation for your team? I think it would be unreasonable to think, I think in large part, majority of workflows should be able to finish in under 10 minutes. I don't think that 10 minutes is incredibly high. I mean, I don't think that there's a scenario in which 10 minutes is going to be too difficult for your team to achieve. I think if you're running workflows that run longer than 10 minutes and you are convinced that your workflows are optimal and that they're efficient, you probably have an idea of what type of signal that you need to get from that workflow and a good reason for it to run that long. And I think that there's always opportunities for us to get this back as quickly as possible. Again, if we need to mitigate bad signal, we need this to come as quickly as possible. So we want these things to run as fast as possible, but we also need to make sure that we get as much value out of them as we possibly can. half of all builds finish in under 4 minutes. I just mentioned that. And so like I said, I think that the goal for those types for that particular metric for organizations should be something on the order of 10 minutes. Success rate. So success rate is one I think that is interesting. I think it's interesting through the same lens of throughput, in that, you know, I certainly want to know the number of increments of work that are being pushed through my system as an engineering manager, as an engineering lead in engineering leadership. This type of information is highly valuable to me. It's far more valuable than number of lines, right? Like I'm thinking of actual work moving through my system, and success rate is the number of times actual work moves through my system successfully, right? So this is also something that's going to be highly valuable for me to understand, to track, to make sure that you know, I understand where the rest of the industry is, or for things like this, and I can, you know, adequately motivate my team to meet standards and ideas for these types of metrics. And so, you know, success rate, like I just said, this is how often your pipeline completes with the green status. Completing with the green status, I mean, the other side of this is completing with the red status, clearly, and like, you know, it's going to be test failure, it's going to be build failure, it's going to be pipeline failure. You're going to need some type of thing that is the signal that you're looking for, so that when the end of your automation scripts do run, that you do know whether or not you have production ready code. That's ultimately our goal with continuous integration tools, right? Is to always leave our applications in a position where they're always ready to be deployed, and we can deploy based on business interests. We can deploy based on the release cycles that our organizations create, and our code is always ready. Here's what that looks like through the data. I mean, this is I find this pretty interesting, because I do stare at this and look at this type of thing an awful lot. But this might not be such a great surprise, and it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of action here. But you know, I do get to look at the data through a little bit more of a fine lens. And so through that lens, what I do see here is some things that are interesting, right? There's probably going to be different behavior. I mean, different Git flow models for application development are going to be, utilized at different organizations. And so there's going to, super common Git flows are short-lived branch development, emerging to main lines once tests are passing. And so, feature development probably means I run workflow on a feature branch. And then once I pass tests and I'm fine with that, then I merge one time to master, right? Or to the main line. And so once I start seeing that, those types of signals, like the majority of workflows that are going to be run on CircleCI are going to be merges to the main branch. And so the main branch is one that has your application ready to go. And so that's the one that's probably going to be the most important branch for you to keep green. And so that's the one that we see here is most of the time green. I mean, 61%. I don't think is too bad because like I said, I think that there's a lot of application development that's done on feature branches. And so you're going to see a lot of lower success rate on those branches. And then you're going to have a large number of workflows that are only run on merge to the main branch. And in those scenarios, you're going to have a very high percentage. And so the combination of those two looks like about 61%. And I want to, the real value of using continuous integration tools is that bad signal or failed signal. I won't call it bad signal, but a failing signal isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, if it takes an incredibly long time to mitigate a failed signal, I would say that that is a bad thing. But when I see 61%, what that says is innovation, right? A continuous integration tool gives you the opportunity to push increments of code through your system, see how that would behave, and then decide whether or not that packet of information gets ultimately added to your code base. And so knowing that there is protection from you introducing bad code into the code base through your continuous integration tooling does give you the confidence to be able to push commits and not worry about bringing down your production server through that process if you didn't have perfect code in that. And so testing and understanding your signal are two of the really big value adds that continuous integration tooling will get you. And so that dichotomy that we see there, 5% or fifth percentile is at 0. It jumps to 61% at 50th percentile, and then it's at 100% above 90th percentile. What that says is that, there's a good deal of folks that are in our group that are only dabbling with CircleCI, or not with CircleCI, but with continuous integration, but they don't always get a working build. There's a number, like 0% means that there's a number of workflows in there that in the 30 days in which we measured our data set, there's a number of workflows in there that never passed. So that's where we get zeros from. And then some of them saw no failures within a month. So you get the 100%. That's where those two signals come from. But I think that looking at that through a little bit more of a fine-grained lens, and starting to understand what happens on branches and not just on all branches in total, I think it gives a little bit more interesting picture. Recovery time, mean time to recovery. This again, I think is the absolute most valuable metric of the 4 that we're going to discuss today. Recovery time is the time that your pipeline sits in a failure state. So no one wants this. Everyone wants their pipelines to be sitting in a green state. The ultimate goal of continuous integration, continuous delivery is to leave our applications in a state where they're always ready to be deployed. We want to deploy based on our business interests. We want to deploy based on the release cycle that is set by our industry and our organization's understanding of its place inside it. We do not want to deploy our applications because of when our engineering teams have the bandwidth or when their tooling allows so. And so mean time to recovery is going to be a major aspect of how we are able to keep our code base in that state. What does it look like? What are the folks doing on CircleCI? Fifth percentile can do it pretty quickly. 2 minutes is incredibly fast. There's a large number of workflows that run very quickly on CircleCI, and so 2 minutes doesn't seem like that's very unreasonable. There's also scenarios in which you can imagine you knowingly commit bad code and then immediately follow up with a fix that then builds right behind the workflow that you just pushed. And so that could look like a branch or a workflow going from green to red to back to green in a short period of time, even though that wouldn't necessarily be a symbolic of finding error or of discovering error or discovering a failed build, a red build, and then being able to mitigate that signal through the developer tools that you usually use to debug. We have 50 percentile here at 55 minutes, 11 seconds. That's pretty fast, I would say. 1 hour for mitigation of issues, I think, is what we should all strive for as organizations. Ideally, we would want to drive this number to 0. I don't think that it's possible to get it to 0, but there is no reason why 10 minutes is good enough, or even 3 minutes is good enough. This is always something that you want to be able to remedy as absolutely fast as possible. If there's a way to get more seconds, or get it to decrease seconds to get closer and closer to eliminating this time. I mean, within reason, all workflows take at least a certain period of time, so you would only be able to recover in the length of time that it takes for another workflow to run. And so, but like ideally getting this number as low as possible is going to be what is desired by most teams. 3.4 days is incredibly long. That's probably much longer than most of us would want any of our applications to sit into a failed state. But the real value of being able to use continuous integration tools is also collaboration. One of the real value propositions for continuous integration tools is collaboration. So there's lots of different ways that we can get codes to our workflows to switch from red to green. Bigger teams are going to be able to do that much more efficiently than teams that are a little bit smaller. And then another interesting thing that we saw is the gap between the 50th and 70th percentiles is incredibly large. It kind of grows reasonably, not quite linearly, but it grows reasonably up until the 50th percentile. And then there's kind of a step to a larger 75th percentile. And so what that looks like is it represents, we think that it represents getting a failed build towards the end of the day and then not being able to mitigate that signal until the following day, because the time gap there is of about 9.5 hours, looks like coming in the next day and then having a few minutes before you're able to resolve that bug. I spoke a little bit about this earlier. This is the branch information that is going to be a little bit more interesting for things like success rate. And let's just look at a little bit of what that looks like, because there's definitely going to be different behavior on individual branches, whether they be the main branch of the application or one of the a forked branch. One of the most interesting things that we were able to look at, and this is a really, really interesting data set that we have access to, is it wasn't the introduction, but with last summer's, or it was actually early spring, when a lot of the racial insensitivity in the United States was brought a little bit higher to the forefront through the Eric Garner experience. Or to the George Floyd experience, we also looked to see if there was going to be, because we saw a lot of signal around this, if we were going to see a large number of people that wanted to go into the renaming their default branches for master. And so this was something that we looked into at CircleCI. This is something that we knew a lot of folks were talking about on the web. And this is also something that we would be able to discover through our platform through measuring these deltas. And so did the use of master branch decrease? It hasn't in a significant way yet. It is not a trivial exercise to change the name of your default branch in a repository. And so it is not something that we had been able to successfully accomplish at CircleCI until we were able to get to, here, let me see, I skipped through, until we were able to get to this place where GitHub was able to offer us a tool where this is something that's a significantly easier thing for us to accomplish. And so just, in looking at these data sets, there's always these, more interesting things that we can kind of pull out. But we try to stick to, comparisons with the larger organizations. But when you do things like splitting out branch behavior, this one was one of the first, what was top of mind to investigate. And so we looked into whether that was the case. We're very happy to see that GitHub has given us a first-class way to do this with repositories now. And we expect to measure this again this year and see, the expectation is that we'll see there's a large number of people that are changing the name of that. And that's a very interesting way to, use these data sets to recognize that, ultimately it's human beings that are developing software. I think we all recognize that ultimately it's human beings that are consuming our software, but there are times, especially when we talk about optimizations and efficiencies on teams, that it can be a little bit more distant from the, it's human beings that actually develop our applications as well. And so teams are innovating on and experimenting on feature branches. This was something that was very, very clear to us from the data set. And so what does that look like? It looks like success rate is significantly higher on the main branch than it is on the non-default branches. That looks like 50th percentile is 80% for default, 50 and 58% for non-default. And so again, I said that default branch is where my application lives in a truly continuous integration, continuous delivery scenario. My application is always ready to be deployed. And so 80%, I would say, is too low. I would say that 80% is not the success rate that I would want on my main branch. I think that I would want to aim for higher than 90%. I mean, I don't think I would ever want it to be not green, but there are scenarios in which that's not going to be the case. But these are expectations that we could have that are very, very high for the main application or service, to use the language of the surveys. We would want a success rate that is enormously high, as close to 100% as we could get. Being reasonable, I think we start setting those baselines at something like 90%. That we have 58% for non-default branches. 61% was the average, was 50th percentile over all of them, over all of the workflows in our set, including default and non-default together. What I said was that looks to me like innovation. You don't create net new code time and time again perfectly. I've yet to see an engineering team that was able to accomplish that and do that at scale. So when I think of what it takes to really push the edge, what it takes to create performant and exciting and experimental applications, I think it looks like some failed builds. And so I look to see those types of things, but I wouldn't necessarily want to see that same level of experimentation on my main or default branch. So that gets me through most of what I had to cover today. I mean, this is the real pull from this is, how can engineering teams set meaningful goals in the coming year? We know what the baselines are, right? Like we have an idea of ways that we can come up with baselines, but are those baselines reasonable, or are those baselines enough? I mean, should we have the expectation of above 90% workflow success rate for our main branch, 10% or less duration for a workflow to run, mean time to recovery under an hour, and a throughput? I mean, again, the throughput I think is interesting to your team, really. I think that you would never want to see a decrease in throughput for any extended period of time, but the number of times that your work is pushed through your system is probably dependent on many things that are outside of the scope of CircleCI's ability to measure. And so, making sure that you don't have anomalous throughput behavior is probably the most thing that's important there. But if you were to hit what we think are reasonable numbers for these things, where does that put you? And so, most of what I described earlier as far as the interesting spaces were the 50th percentiles, right? And so when mapped against this survey data, continuous integration users show up at about 50th percentile, and that's between medium and high performers at an org level. So where am I pulling this from? So this is a Puppet report from a couple of years ago, and this was a table that they created. What they have here is high IT performers, medium IT performers, and low IT performers. And again, this is survey data, so they're looking at something that's not quite one-to-one with the 4 things that we can measure, but they're pretty similar. And so we should probably be able to, make a connection between the things that they're talking about here and the things that we can actually measure. But once we do make that connection, what is it where is it that we show up? So it's here. It's actually this space right between medium IT performers and high IT performers. I mean, this is pretty wild that the 50th percentile of CircleCI users show up at this state. I think that when a lot of people first get introduced to these industry reports, the fear is that they might find themselves in the low IT performers. Like, what does it take to get all the way up there? I think that these larger industry reports have done the due diligence of convincing the industry that continuous integration is worth it and it's valuable. And so a lot of the folks that are on CircleCI aren't just using continuous integration for the first time. They understand the value of continuous integration. They understand the value of feedback loops, and they understand the paradigms in which they're operating their engineering teams in order to achieve these results. And so we see even average behavior on our platform reaching these near elite tiers. And so that's really what our takeaway is for today. The big step for your organization is in choosing to do continuous integration. And I say continuous integration over and over again because I really do feel like the main point is the feedback loop. The 2 metrics that I said were most important is duration and mean time to recovery. Making sure that you can get those 2 things optimal is going to expose the real value add that continuous integration tools and the continuous integration philosophy for application development really does add to your engineering team, because it is through creativity and it is through mitigating error that we are able to create and build the best tools and best products for our customers. And on top of that, the people who are pushing the most workflows on our platform are doing even better than that. Like if the 50th percentile rides that line, and some of them are even in the elite tier for some of those metrics, then being on a fully featured continuous integration tool that gives you the opportunity to really understand, measure, and be able to then implement new things into your application development pipeline so that you can make incremental changes on some of these metrics is going to give you an enormous lead on the folks that are still trying to spin up their continuous integration understanding or are just collecting automation scripts and aren't really able to expose the real value of being able to create these feedback loops and these rich ways to mitigate bad signal. So where do we go from here? I think we need to gather more data. I think that, I mean, that's always going to be my default is gather more data, look at this more, slice it up more, do these things more. But there's, you know, the next step I don't think is necessarily understanding where my organization is on all of these 4 metrics. I think it's understanding what are the things that I can do and that I can measure that really get a little bit closer to the value that I need to be able to create from my team. And so, you know, being on a continuous integration tool that gives you access to enormous or a rich amount of data is going to be really valuable in order to make those types of decisions for your teams. And making those types of decisions will probably look very different for your team than it does for a lot of other teams. And so I highly encourage you to measure your team's performance, to come up with your own metrics and to make sure that you're able to incrementally improve on all of the ones that make sense to you. At the same time, the 4 metrics that we were able to discuss here, there's no reason why these aren't the top 4 things. I mean, if you haven't been able to get these into a range that look reasonable compared to what we were able to discuss here, there has to be some really good reasons, or that's probably where you need to start. After that, it does get into the little fine-tuned things. I think you want to be able to match the ways that you're measuring your team to the real product that it is that you're creating and ultimately your organization's goals. So that's what I have today. That was a whole lot. I assume that there's going to be questions. I appreciate that you all gave me as much time as you did today, and I will be happy to answer questions. If you leave them in the Q&A after this presentation, I will be able to address them in a timely fashion at that point. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of the conference.